Good morning, everyone. Uh, Thank you for being here. For those that don't know me, my name is Sebastian Edwards, and I'm a professor. I've been a professor for a very long time, probably since before most of you were born. And I'm the director of the Center for Global Management, and we are very honored to have today with us Hwee Hua Lim, one of our most distinguished alumnus from Asia, who's going to talk to us about government in business. Hwee Hua is a advisor to the legendary KKR, former cabinet minister in Singapore, author of the book that has the same title of the talk. And I've gotten to know her because she's one of the founding members of the board of advisors to the Center of Global Management. And she's wise and to the point, a no-nonsense lady, the kind of person that you really enjoy talking to. The topic is a very important one, and one that, for some reason, tends to be absent from many business school discussions. And of course, government, it's at the center of society, and for better or for worse, whatever we try to do, we run into government restrictions, constraints, regulations, guidance. So we are very, very fortunate to have Hwee Hua Lim with us today. She's going to make a presentation, and then we're going to have a conversation, which I will moderate, and of course will be open to everyone in the room. So thank you so much, and let's welcome our guest.
Hello. Yeah. Thank you very much, Sebastian. It's a real pleasure and luxury to be here today. During my time at UCLA, the premises were rather different. I think you have some very nice facilities here, but anyway, let me just say that I'm happy to speak on the topic of government in business, whether you view government as a friend or foe. But this is an emotional debate everywhere I go. Many of you will probably describe the role or the presence of government in the economy as pervasive, or sometimes negatively as the long arm of government. And depending on which country and the stage of economic development, the role of government in business can often be friendly or even necessary, say for the emerging economies. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, people think that the government should simply get out of business and leave the private sector to operate the market. In other words, don't crowd out the private sector. And these are sort of the prevailing views. Well, it hits home in a real and usually painful way in recent years. What you see is rising nationalism, plus you have also increasing politicization of economics. And as far as the investors are concerned, there is an increase in sovereign and policy risks that no investor in Asia or for the rest of the world should actually ignore. Let me just give you some examples where you can actually see the long arm of government. For example, in Thailand, where there is now unstable economics from the political unrest that has been unfolding over the last many months, adding loads of uncertainty and paralysis in government. The installation of the interim military government has not helped with the assessment of sovereign risks. And in this case, the long arm of the government has enveloped the entire country and the economy as well. Over in Argentina, you have the nationalization of the national icon, or YPF, which is the first state-owned oil company, through an expropriation of a 51% stake from the Spanish energy giant Repsol. Just to recap, YPF was actually privatized way back in 1993, but because of the burden of public debt, the fragile the economy, as well as the national sort of peso coming under pressure, the government has seen it fit to actually pass laws to allow the government to set profit margins and to confiscate goods from private companies. I'm just lifting this off from what I've read. But what we see here is essentially legalization of an extension of the already long arm of government. Because of the politicization of economics, governments are increasingly shifting towards what we all now refer to as short-termism. And any government that's not populist in its stance runs the risk of losing the right to govern and to govern and be given the mandate to set the policy agenda. Sorry, that's what's going on. But let me just say, as a counterpoint to that event, that intense government participation is not always a bad thing. Let me at this point just do a quick poll. Now, how many of you carry the Visa card? Okay. MasterCard? You probably can lift your hands without having to think very hard. Amex? Okay. Union Pay? Right. Okay. Now, do you know that by all accounts, Union Pay is now the largest card scheme, not just in China, but also in the world. And there are some 2.9 billion Union Pay cards in issue, which is more than a quarter share of the global marketplace. Union Pay is accepted in 141 countries, which is essentially most countries. Why am I talking about Union Pay? Just a bit of history. Union Pay was established back in 2002 under the approval of the State Council and the People's Bank of China, which is a central bank, as a unified interbank clearing and settlement system. And it engages in bank card services just like Visa, MasterCard, and Amex. But it was appointed as the sole settlement system for all renminbi denominated card transactions. So all ATMs, merchants have to accept Union Pay. And the mission of Union Pay is to become a bank card association with national authority and trustworthiness, as well as international competitiveness and influence. Now, in response to the complaints around the world, China has gradually reduced the level of protection for Union Pay. But that's really no longer relevant because Union Pay will ride on the rapid growth of Chinese tourist outflow throughout the world. Now, I brought up Union Pay to illustrate how an active government hand can actually secure a lasting global position, whatever the reasons were for heavy intervention at the beginning. And there are many equally compelling situations that warrant intense state participation. Whether the government should take an equity interest or not depends on which role or which combination of roles will meet the goal in question. So in other words, there's no one-size-fits-all strategy or approach. Let me just take you through some of the areas where I'm sure you agree with me are the areas that serve strategic or national interests that the government's presence is very much needed. It is the responsibility of every government to safeguard strategic or national interests, and how each government fulfills this responsibility, of course, can be a world of difference, whether it's from the Americas or to Europe or to Asia. So what economic activity would be considered to be of strategic or national interest? Let me suggest some here. It will obviously straddle a whole spectrum. For example, the provision of essential services like public housing, to investing in critical infrastructure like railways or ports, to helping businesses, especially the small and medium enterprises in most countries, to support them in the growth, as well as to develop new capabilities that an economy may not have. And increasingly, the bailouts of national icons whenever crises come around, where the countries feel that they cannot afford to have a national icon fail. Most of these areas, if not all, will normally entail substantial investments, as you can imagine, with the construction of an airport or the national broadband network. So in short, state participation is really necessary where there is market failure or where the economics do not stack up, except in the very long term, if at all. So this is where we will then come into a discussion of where, or rather the many roles that the government can participate in business and the many roles that it can actually play. So we have, as what we all understand, the traditional role, which is government as a policy formulator and executor of the policies, where it provides for the national budget, where it manages, it provides for fiscal management and it manages the national budget, providing for both recurrent as well as development expenditure. And for strategic businesses, government will usually prescribe a regulatory framework that will ensure that the provision of services will be orderly and not held hostage to economics. And this is, of course, most pervasive and common in the financial services sector, especially banking. Now, whether it's for infrastructure or for deepening creative capabilities, very often the government has to also inject capital into operating entities, most commonly referred to as state-owned enterprises or state enterprises, to fulfill its overall game plan. And all countries have state enterprises in some form or other. It's the extent of business participation that is different in terms of the range of businesses as well as the market dominance. So just taking stock of where the economies are at, much, of course, has been said and debated on the whole topic of state capitalism. Most governments like those here in the US, Britain and New Zealand have practically divested the bulk of the shareholding interests in businesses, including the strategic ones. Others like China, Vietnam and Myanmar, for historical reasons, continue to have the state-owned enterprises play a major role in the economy. And there's really, in my view, no right or wrong degree or pace of divestment. Neither is anything static. What works right today or works well today is not necessarily something that will continue to work well in the future. So both in terms of the candidates as well as the timeline for divestment, these are not static decisions. And for example, a downturn could easily throw the plan off track and will require adjustments to divestment plans. So even if the government chooses to conflate the various roles that I've just described, private sector businesses will do well to be familiar with these different roles and to adapt accordingly. Now, more importantly, we need to understand how government will be assessed by the public in order to preempt the likely reactions when a particular role is poorly performed. What would be the political pressures for a particular role? It is always easiest for any government to regulate itself out of a problem, just slap on more rules, disallow increases to price of essential services and goods. But this moral hazard is evident when, particularly when providing for services like public transportation, housing, healthcare, or preschool education. And as I said, increasing politicization of economics does not help either. So governments these days are expected to be very much alive to the electorate's wishes, be it from the provision of very mundane daily services on the one hand to the massive bailouts of failing national icons. Governments are expected to be alive to what the public want them to do. More and more so, elected governments, as I say, live or die by the ballot box, breeding short-termism, unfortunately, as a permanent feature of domestic politics. This means that long-term initiatives are increasingly being subject to short-term performance scrutiny, and that's a real difficult gap to bridge. So how is the government rated? What is the accountability for each role? For example, as a fiscal manager, would it be judged by its ability to record a budget balance, or by the size of the public debt, or by the degree of unemployment? As a business supporter, is it by the GDP growth rates, or as I said, unemployment rate as well? As a regulator, would it be the ease of doing business in terms of the degree of compliance as required of various rules or by various rules? As a provider of capital, would it be judged by how constructive it is as a partner, or would it be judged by the returns on the capital that it has deployed to the various businesses? This takes the form of a different series of questions that I would like to share with you here. For economic sustainability, the government has to maintain discipline when engaging in business. So regardless of the roles, but just to maintain discipline in the various ways. And if nothing else, maintaining discipline is often the most difficult and requires the greatest amount of political will when changes are needed. Well, of the many questions that you see here, relevant to discipline itself, the why participate question is the most important, but it does not get asked often enough. In fact, over time, it's important to ask whether the reasons for participation remain valid. So it may be valid at one point in time, but over time you really need to review whether those reasons are still valid. And it is possible and in fact very common for the government to overstay its usefulness in a particular business segment. So it goes in with a good reason, everybody agrees, and then it just overstays its usefulness. And why do they overstay the usefulness? Usually for various reasons like, oh, you need to preserve national icons, you need to control them. There is also a desire for continued control for policy execution. So there's always an instrument through which government can execute policy changes. Or there's simply an absence of a clear objective when assessing what's an appropriate exit trigger. Certainly we need to look no further than the airline arena, where there are plenty of examples of how involvement can unwittingly run counter to the efforts at instilling commercial discipline. There are just so many examples in the airline industry. Deciding when to enter is usually easy enough, especially when it involves essential or strategic services. But deciding when to exit is just as, if not more important. Most governments, as you know, will drop a list of state enterprises to privatize or to divest altogether, either partially or altogether. But they always encounter challenges when executing these plans. And you can easily overshoot to over-privatize and later on struggle to see how you can get back control. I'm sure those of you who subscribe to The Economist will recognize this famous cover. But in recent times, the opposite is happening. Some governments are actually forced by the very weak fiscal positions because of the sort of widening budget deficits as well as a growing public debt to divest even strategic assets. So this goes beyond what they might consider to be ideal in normal circumstances. And one needs to look no further than Europe, where several governments have put up the major assets like land, banks, the rights to resources, and even ports on sale in order to avert fiscal distress. So when is the long arm of the government helpful and supportive? When it needs to invest long-term on a massive scale on poor economics, but for essential services. When there is a clear distinction of roles, where the government takes pains to articulate what each role entails and how it plans to execute those roles. And when the state enterprises operate on a fair and level playing field, where they do not benefit from special incentives or discrimination given to them, and where they may be there in numbers, but they do not crowd out the private sector because of the way they operate, and where they are benchmarked against the best in breed. So this is when the long arm of the government can be extremely helpful and supportive. And certainly, it can be longer than necessary when it overstays its usefulness. And that's when the government maintains a very rigid and not dynamic policy or business position where it willfully conflates the different objectives and where it's over-reliant on exerting influence through just ownership and no other means. So let me just take each of these in turn. Well, consistency of position can unwittingly become a vice and present lots of moral hazards to governing for the long haul. In the extreme case, as I was referring to earlier on, it may cost a political leader or the party the mandate to lead or growth. Now, the greatest challenge for any government lies in deciding for essential public goods and services this whole question on, or questions revolving around subsidies. Firstly, whether the subsidies are required, who deserves to receive those subsidies, for how long should the subsidies be given, and how much can the government really afford, because they do not always square up nicely. We have this same debate over and over again in Singapore for healthcare. For example, who should build the hospitals? We have a huge public component in Singapore. So who should build the hospitals? Then for whom and how much should they be subsidized in the public hospitals? Right now, as you know, there are more and more diagnostic tests that are readily available to the masses, but that also means greater public healthcare expenditure. So should public funding be limited to only what's considered basic? And what's basic anyway? Because that definition shifts over time. So the debate goes on and on in Singapore, and I'm sure everywhere else in the world. This challenge confronts governments, both big and small, both developed and emerging economies. It's just a degree, and at different stages, the questions are more or less the same, and yet different in the content. Many factors come into play when shaping public expectations, like affluence, which of course would mean that what's basic gets defined differently over time. More importantly, the perception of the government's ability to offer greater public funding. And there's always a disconnect between the reality and what the public thinks the government should actually hand out. And most significantly, changing values. Who looks after the older folks of society? Is it the families, is it society, or is it government? And these values change over time. So as we can imagine, if the government were to hold on to a static response, it can potentially bring grief to all concerned, because on the one side, we will have a government which cannot comprehend why the same subsidies are no longer good enough despite the heavy fiscal burden. On the other side, you have the public that bemoans how the government has completely lost touch of the current aspirations as far as living standards go. So we can see the wisdom of avoiding too rigid a policy position, yet we can also appreciate that it will be a slippery slope once you start conceding and saying, well, we should do a bit more here, we should subsidize a bit more over there, because the demands will just continue to pile up over time, especially for social needs. So between being too rigid and too populist, governments must strike the right balance and accept that even this right balance shifts over time. Now, being too rigid obviously has its problems, but this is an example that I want to bring up where the government tries to express or to address political issues with policy moves that compromise financial discipline. And even though I'm going to illustrate this with Air India, you can almost repeat the same thing for many other airline companies around the world. So in this case, for Air India, it's really in its retention of a very large workforce, despite the deteriorating economics. Air India not only had an overstaffed workforce, it also suffered from near paralysis in decision-making within the entire government bureaucracy. The airline employed some 30,000 employees, representing an average of, this is just a measure to help us see the relativities. It's 214 employees per aircraft back in 2011-2012. Now, British Airlines, or Airways, employs 178, Singapore Airlines 161. So this is the gap. And this staff strength itself can be partly attributed to political influence. So any streamlining would obviously lead to political fallout. So between streamlining out of necessity and being held to task for poor cost control, the management decided that accountability to the politicians was greater priority. So essentially, state ownership in this case allowed for the personal agendas of government officials to take priority over commercial viability. We still have ministers insisting that there must be routes, there must be services connecting the home states with the capital. And this will continue for as long as there's no political will to say that let's get it right onto a commercial path. And similar stories can be found in the area of public transport, where politics drive policy changes to a simple thing like fare setting, usually much lower than what's budgeted and when the contractors signed on the line. Often this blurring of roles exists for historical reasons. Enterprises were started for a usually specific and well-founded reason to further the mission of a government department. And for ease of execution, convenience, they will be parked under the relevant department. But over time, you will find that very few governments make it a policy to separate the roles. And even when the state enterprises so started have already reached maturity, there's also often the reluctance of losing the availability of a vehicle to execute any changes in policy decisions in the future. Regardless of the difficulty, all governments should consciously avoid using state enterprises as a means to deliver to political or policy ends. And this is because it always comes at the expense of commercial discipline. But for those of you who are familiar with government, and especially for me, having worked in government for many years, the pressure is very real. And one way of mitigating the pressure is to separate the roles and accountability for these state enterprises as early as possible, as one can imagine them to be. And this is how the Singapore government attempts to minimize the possibility of conflating policy and financial objectives, which may not always overlap nicely. For those of you who are familiar, we set up the investment holding company, Temasek Holdings, back in 1974, when we were already encountering some of these issues, to provide on behalf of the Ministry of Finance stewardship of the government's various businesses so that they can be done on a commercial basis. So everything is taken out and parked under one investment holding company. So briefly, this is just to say that governments should avoid conflating the different roles and objectives as far as is possible. Now, when it comes to the crunch, every political leader and public sector will instinctively fall back on ownership control to exert influence. And this is especially so with essential services like banks. In some circumstances, there may be very little choice, such as the bailout by the Japanese government of the Tokyo Electric Power Company, or TEPCO, in the wake of the earthquake and then the nuclear plant disaster. Now, the reassumption of ownership was really to facilitate essential operational control of a rather strategic utility, a rescue that required more than US $120 billion. But does intervention always need to be limited to assumption or resumption of ownership? Are there not other levels that are available through the other roles that government play? Now, as a regulator, the government can count on the imposition of tighter operational rules or laws to shape behavior without having to own any bit of the underlying businesses. And this is most evident again in financial services, where every time there's a crisis, we get a new layering on of more rules and laws in order to make people behave better. And this imposition of more rules obviously introduces a great amount of regulatory risks to existing players, but it is often seen as the lesser of two evils, because otherwise when banks fail, it will be a massive bailout that will be required of governments. So they think that it's better to just lay on more rules in order to avert that. Nonetheless, using regulatory might should not be undertaken lightly. And as it is, there are no conclusive indications that a heavier regulatory burden will lead to better corporate behavior. So what other levels are there at the government's disposal? As a developer or promoter enterprise, the government can certainly offer incentives or carrots to influence behavior. Likewise, in many countries, the government is actually a very big customer and consumer of services. It can therefore incentivize the provision of certain goods and services in a prescribed manner. For example, when it's trying to promote green consciousness by asking for green solutions for all new buildings. These days, many governments face fiscal constraints. So hence, bailouts are no longer the norm. But nonetheless, all governments must constantly explore all possibilities and not be bound by traditional responses, which is to control only through ownership. Now, this was the predicament that the Indian government found itself in when the Satyam Computer Services saga unfolded. Now, Satyam is often referred to as India's Enron, and you will understand what that scale refers to. But the Indian government acquitted itself beautifully without costing taxpayers any bailout rupees. It skillfully and creatively handled an otherwise massive corporate failure in Satyam. So what did the Indian government do? It used its regulatory powers by appointing a new board with new members, who then orchestrated a sale of Satyam services, got the accounts restated properly, and ensured sufficient working capital. And by doing so, the Indian government has demonstrated the importance of thinking out of the box and abandoning all traditional beliefs about influence and control. In other words, just by ownership control, it actually did none of the ownership thing. So in conclusion, let me just say that in many countries, the greatest objection to government's participation in business is usually over the presence or the very existence of state enterprises. The term SOEs in many countries is actually a dirty word, mainly because of the dominant role in the economy. And the private sector in particular feels very crowded out by the very presence. In many markets still, SOEs are favored, which means there's an uneven level playing field. They get subsidized loans, they get contracts without having to go through a public tender. It is therefore important that the government constantly reviews the degree of involvement in business, both in good times and bad. Now, during a crisis, the calls on government to bail out national icons or institutions are often loud and persistent. And previous calls to exit the market are soon forgotten. So this can happen, the moment there's a crisis ahead. And the truth is, the cycle repeats itself. So you go through a good phase, and the private sector says, can you please get out of the marketplace? Before the government can get out of the marketplace, the market turns, there's a sort of a great recession. Everybody screams at the government, why aren't you bailing out these companies? Why are you getting out of this? You should get back in again into the banks and so on. So this cycle repeats itself. But at the other end of the spectrum, successful state-owned enterprises were, as we are now seeing a lot, out of Singapore, not just Singapore, but certainly out of China, successful state-owned enterprises are expanding beyond the domestic market, and quite often then you encounter a new issue, which is foreign relations. Sovereignty issues would come into the picture as well. Regardless of the size of the combined presence of state enterprises within the different domestic markets, the key is actually to maintain and ensure that there is commercial discipline. And in which case, if that were the case, then the government can remain a friend in business. Now, finally, let me end by saying that whenever I hear an assault on state enterprises, as there could be many, that they should really get out of the marketplace, I would usually just ask, then who's going to build the hospitals, who's going to build the roads, who will run the schools and so on. So with effort, I believe the government can remain a friend to business. And certainly, I believe that most of you who have had encounters, positive or otherwise, can share your views as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hwee Hua. That was fascinating. I was taking notes and checking the internet for all the questions I want to ask. Let me start by saying that it was not only a great talk, I think it was very Singapore-centered, which of course makes a lot of sense, since not only you come from there, but that's where your experience is from. So the one word that was missing from the talk, I think it was missing, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is the C word, corruption. It was completely absent. And I was born a long time ago in Latin America. I've been living in this country forever, but I just came back from Buenos Aires, from Argentina, 4 days ago. So the one thing that I was trying to do in my I have to get an iPhone 6. Right. It was try to get to the Transparency International Corruption Index website, which I finally managed to do. And Singapore is the 5th least corrupted country out of 200. Okay, so if you are from Singapore, you look at the world from a completely different perspective than if you are from the best, in spite of the World Cup, the best soccer playing country in the world, which is Argentina, which is number 120 in terms of least corrupt. It's one of the most corrupt. And India, the whole story about India, which was such it's a very corrupt country. I'm sorry to say that in front of our India. So my first question to you, how generalizable is your view? Where, I mean, if you talk to most people in Russia, friend or foe, oh my God, Putin turned 62 years old yesterday, and everyone says, oh, I mean, by the time he retires, he's going to own the whole country. I mean, isn't this, aren't you looking at it through a really rose-tinted crystal? And Singapore, of course, is, as I said, almost no corruption.
Right. This is the elephant in the room, right?
Right.
No, I was just being subtle about the whole thing. Well, it's sort of wrapped under this whole thing about commercial discipline. Because if you have true commercial discipline, then the state-owned enterprises would have to go through market tests, so which means that they should do well in any public auction, public tender that the government hands out. And the government must then hand out contracts without having to go through a layer, which usually is corruption in many markets. So in order to achieve true commercial discipline, all governments really need to work through that. And it's not just on the side of government. I mean, businesses themselves, as a reaction to corruption, practice that as well in order to get contracts. But I would say that a lot depends, or a lot of the responsibility would rest on governments themselves to ensure that they get rid of corruption as far as possible. Let me just maybe illustrate this by an example in China, where everybody, well, even the government leadership is going after corruption in a huge way. But it's important to set this and to understand that it takes years. Singapore in the 60s, the mid-60s, I think was corrupt too. But it took us like 3-4 decades. So that now there's a lot of peer pressure against it, so nobody does it because you'll be the only odd one out.
Caned, you'll be caned.
Well, you'll be jailed. But it's sort of in the DNA. Nobody does it. Nobody wants to do it because it's just not the done thing. So it will take time, and therefore we should, I think, applaud changes, incremental changes, rather than to continue to say that corruption still exists and it's difficult. Because I think most governments try their best to bring that about. I mean, a lower level of corruption.
Yeah. Okay. So let me then move to another question. So I think that everything I want to ask you goes under this umbrella that it's very hard to replicate the very good results in Singapore and other parts of the world. This is what my theme is going to be. And that's because Singapore is a very special country, wonderful people, very disciplined, have great universities and programs, including our own program in Singapore, right? And it's a very small country. So let's assume that there is a role for state-owned enterprises, which some people dispute. I think that there is a role for. So now the question, which I'm not sure that in Singapore is relevant, but it's relevant in other parts of the world. Should these state-owned enterprises be owned by the national government, or should they be at the local government level, where accountability, it's presumably much higher, where your neighbor is going to be on the board of the water treatment plant, rather than some bureaucrat in the capital, which in the large countries, it's, I don't know, you never get there because the airline went bankrupt, by the way. So shouldn't we try to think that it's better to do it at the local level rather than at the national level? Or is this not an issue at all?
Well, it's not something that Singapore faces as
right, because it's a small country, right?
But based on my observation, I mean, and it's not the philosophy here that I'm talking about, but rather the practice of it. Unfortunately, when things are delegated down to local governments, that's where corruption, creeps in. And well, it's both the corruption creeping in as well as the lack of appreciation for why certain rules or laws on stewardship and investments were made in the first place. So you lose that policy disconnect or connect, which is so essential So again, back to, say, a big place like China, where they have the state-owned enterprise. There's the centrals of agency, SASAC, that administers. It sets the rules and so on. It has national state-owned enterprises under its charge, but it's got a whole lot, thousands and thousands of what they call local state-owned enterprises. And the difficulty is actually in ensuring that the laws that are passed at the central level actually get executed to the full intent that they were, made. And so you need to actually supplement this or complement this with strict enforcement, as well as constant sort of incentives as well for people to behave correctly.
Okay, so that's a great answer. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to open up. Is there? I think we're taping this. Is there a microphone that will be? Yeah. Okay. Great. So Marcia has the mic. Oh, but before I forget, and I plead guilty. This event is co-sponsored by the Laskin Center at the law school, and we thank them for their support. And I should have said that at the beginning, but I just had to say it when I remembered to say it, which was right now. Let me talk about governance, which again, it's in Singapore it works well, if I understand correctly. Some of the largest natural resource companies, because it's, as you say, a strategic sector in the world, are state-owned enterprises. Now, I want to give 3 or 4 examples, all of them from Latin America. Pemex, where at the Cantarell site, production has halved because there's been very little investment and it's been mismanaged. Pemex is not run under a governance system that applies to corporations, regular privately owned corporations. It has its own rules. Petrobras, which used to be run, now the government started intervening, and now it's abandoned a commercial view. Codelco, the largest copper producer in the world, has different rules than publicly owned companies. YPF, now that it was expropriated, well, actually, Repsol was fully compensated by $6 billion, and they were very happy to get out of Argentina. So shouldn't the state-owned enterprises be held accountable and use the identical governance system and be regulated by the same SEC and so on as the private sector, or do they deserve different rules?
As a politician, or ex-politician, I shouldn't be saying this, but usually the politicians are to be blamed because governments are given to short-term pressures, and they would, for example, if it means that you want to streamline state enterprise that will be efficient and so on, it means you're going to lose so many jobs. There's usually a lack of political will to say, let's carry on with the restructuring or streamlining. So let's carry on for whatever it takes to serve political outcomes and purposes. So the lack of political will is frequently the cause of all these problems. I mean, BBC is another example. I mean, it's bloated. So, but the days of reckoning will come because most governments are running out of funds to help the state-owned enterprises. And then when the days of reckoning come, you have to take the hard decisions. Many airline companies are having to restructure because the governments can no longer afford to bail them out.
Okay. So let me open up for questions from the floor. And let's start over there. Marcia, the back row there. And state your name. And I guess your question.
Good afternoon, Lim, Hwee Hua. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm Rebecca Bellecci, and a first-year student at Anderson, and I know that everyone here would have really enjoyed your talk. I wanted to focus on you stating that the government is a friend to business, and focus on you talking about private sector as a private sector incentivization. I think for economies like the EU, which are experiencing a recession, do you agree that stimulating the private sector is essential in helping them pull out of this recession? And how do you avoid hothousing certain sectors, which will only provide short-term innovation rather than long-term growth for the economy? And can you think of any real-world examples where the private sector has helped national competitive advantage and local unemployment?
Well, I think it depends on what is the aggregate presence of the state-owned enterprises in that particular economy. In an economy like New Zealand or the UK or the US, where state-owned enterprises in aggregate are not really a big number, the private sector can actually do a whole lot more and might be key to driving the economy onto the path of men if there is a crisis. In which case, then the respective governments should focus all their attentions on giving incentives to encourage more innovation, more creativity, more market expansion, and so on. Now, in markets like the emerging ones, well, China is not so emerging, but China, Vietnam, Myanmar, where the state-owned enterprises are a huge part of the economy, you can't get away from it. So you have to revitalize the economy if there is a downturn through the state-owned enterprises. And in order to make sure that the capital doesn't get wasted, then you need strict discipline about what will be delivered at the end of that, capital sort of infusion. Yeah.
Okay, other questions over here? We're going to go here from right to left, from my right to my left.
Hi. First of all, thank you for the amazing talk. My name is Amirali Gasemipur, and I'm a FEMBA 2017. So I was really happy that you mentioned the idea of corruption, but I also wanted to add religion because I come from a place, the majority of my work experience is internationally and abroad outside the US. And I've worked in Iran, which is a heavily regulated country and very religious as well. So most of the prohibiting regulations are founded in religion, and it's a country that corruption runs rampant. And it's often used as a veil to, for corruption. So I want to ask you, where do you see the Middle East in particular going 5-10 years from now? And do you see the situation improving globally and the Middle East as a population country being connected more to the West, or is it going to go the other way around?
I'll offer you a pragmatic response, which is if the Middle East in general is going to be an exporter of capital, then what happens is the Middle Eastern investors will adapt according to the markets that they're looking at. Because the markets in the US, in Europe, will continue to function along those lines. Now, but for the investors that are going inward into the Middle East region, then they would need to pay attention to the local factors, as I call them. So whether it's religion, whether it's culture, they would have to operate around those market conditions in the same way as it may be in many other markets as well. So a lot depends on whether the capital is flowing in or out. As far as I understand, the Middle East is fast becoming an exporter of capital. And I believe that as they reach out beyond the region, they're actually fairly adaptable to the local conditions. Now, what it does within the Middle East, then it's a question of whether they need the capital from outside. If they need to import capital, I'm quite sure that there will be a recognition of that, and the rules will then be changed to become more friendly to investors. The other point I will mention is the marketplace is fast becoming a borderless one. So as they export, even if it's a very successful local business, as it exports and reaches out beyond the domestic market, it may also adapt accordingly.
Yes. Where you're getting it. There's a lagged response here.
Hello, thanks again. My name is Ben Chung. I'm a first-year student at Anderson. You mentioned Singapore used to have some corruption in the government, say 30, 40 years ago, but has made a lot of improvement in that time period. what are some of the key changes that Singapore has done to improve the corruption, and what kind of, I guess, what characteristics are more translatable to other more corrupt governments, such as India or Argentina, as you said?
Well, in the mid-60s, for those of you who might not be familiar with Singapore's history, basically we separated, well, the British left us and we separated from Malaysia. So Singapore became sort of independent with absolutely no resources. So it had to depend a lot on foreign investments. And the only way you could get foreign investors interested was that you run a clean, transparent system that people would want to put some money in. So it's really born out of necessity and pragmatism that the Singapore economy functioned entirely on running a very clean system. So it starts right, the tone starts right at the top, from government into various layers of government, into business. We had strict laws. And over time, you see, when the laws are not clearly defined or when they are not actually enforced, you get corruption having its full play. But in our case, we were very, very strict about that. And in fact, right up to now, the number of cases that we're actually prosecuting on corruption, cases alone is actually very, very small. So it needs time, and you need to set the tone from the top.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
My name is Sudan Guo. I'm the first year at Anderson full-time MBA. I'm just wondering your view on the current tension between the Hong Kong and the Chinese government right now. Do you still think that Chinese government can be a friend to Hong Kong's business?
Mm-hmm. Well,
That's a hard one.
that's a hard one.
If you want, I can say time's up. Okay, I'm for a small side payment under the table. I'm willing to do that. Oh, by the way, so hold on, we're being taped. That was a joke, by the way.
So you need to edit that out of the...
No, you can leave it in, but it was a joke. Okay, there's no under the table thing here.
Well, I lived for 2 years in Hong Kong, so I'm actually quite close to, quite a friend to Hong Kong. But of course, I'm not the Hong Kong government, so that's quite different. No, I think it's a question of how Hong Kong figures in the overall game plan of China, and what that means for the people of Hong Kong. Because if you were to see how, I liken this to an envelope being pushed to test the limits of what's the understanding of a free market, of a free sort of, society and a free people. And I think that definition is sort of blurring at the edges, and that tension comes about because there is some blurring around the edges. So what's understood by the Hong Kong people to be what they think they were expecting to get is obviously very different from what I think the mainland Chinese government is actually talking about. At some point, they would have to, sort of figure that out. But as far as whether that has an impact on Hong Kong business, no, I think the Hong Kong economy functions just as well. People are very practical about how the economy runs. If at all, it may take the marginal foreign investment to sort of shift out somewhere else. But I would say I'm actually optimistic. It may take time, but I'm optimistic that at some point they will come to some mutual understanding.
Okay, that's a great way to come to an end, an optimistic note about Hong Kong and the rest of the world, in spite of how the market has behaved today. So we want to thank Hwee Hua for sharing her thoughts and talking about her book with us. Thank you so much.